January the 6th, 2026. Guys, thank all of you that joined us this morning for the speech by Trump. And I was watching it for key moments. We know we get the same rhetoric about all the accomplishments and things like that, but there's some key things going on we need to pay very close attention to. One of them is this, and this is from the Cuban embassy here in the U.S. It's Emba Cuba, U.S. on X. The Cuban embassy in the U.S. honored in an emotional gathering the memory of the 32 Cubans who recently died in Venezuela and condemned the blatant violation of all norms of international law by the U.S. government, which is exerting its imperial power over America. Now, the 32 Cubans were Maduro's guards, and they were Cubans. And what this is pointing to, we're going to read a little more, is, and it probably goes back to around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe in the 60s, but it has to do with that and any type of embargoes that was put on Cuba. What it did, it looks like, is forced them to basically infiltrate Cuba and take it over. And I think they had everything to do with the last couple of elections there, and now they're right here admitting it. And so the pieces are coming together. I noticed, and if I have time, I'll put it up, but on the plane yesterday with Trump and Lindsey Graham, a couple of other guys, they had a press gaggles, what they call it, on the back. And so they were asking questions, and Lindsey Graham said, Cuba is a big part of all of this, and they better watch their backs. And Trump has already said it too. Now, remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the embargoes started, I think it was because Russia had infiltrated Cuba, bought them off or something, and either had put missile bases there, possibly, or had threatened to. I'm not sure exactly. I'd have to look it up, but we can get past that point. Now, you guys look it up. And then you had the Bay of Pigs, and that was a disgrace, by the way, for the U.S. It was just about as bad as Afghanistan. Not on the same scale, but pretty bad. Anyway, it looks like the embargoes and all of those sanctions has forced Cuba into Venezuela, because they can't get it into Cuba correctly. But what this does, and again, that's what it looks like, then Cuba's involved in the drug trade, fentanyl, and any other thing going on, because if they're the ones running it, why was it all Cubans, 32 Cubans? We're going to take a look at the picture they put up, guarding Maduro. Why wasn't it Venezuelan forces? Because I don't think they are in control. This looks like a move that has been busted, and when you start seeing Trump and people like Lindsey Graham, Lindsey loves war, we know that. But in this case, he may be right. If the threat's that close, Trump said on the plane, we have cut the money off from Cuba, because all their money came from Venezuela, which means drug cartel money. It also means Iranian proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, had infiltrated Venezuela. So it was like a plan coming through South America up to Cuba and Mexico. Much worse than just what we initially thought. But in the last 4 years before this administration, we saw the disaster that happened at the border and the infiltration. And what I'm feeling is a sense of we need to move very quickly, because they're inside, they're outside. You got gangs from several South American nations here, and the border is much more important now when you look at it in this way. Think about it. Now, someone said that Canada is kind of in the limelight of being on the stupid side of this too. But I think we're ready, but the problem is it could create a very tense world situation. You guys that watched yesterday, I think we watched the United Nations, and it was maybe 60% crying about it, and 40%, especially South American nations and some European nations, were glad that it happened. And Venezuela was celebrating in the streets. Now, there were some conflicts last night about some type of drones or something, and some shootings, but they were celebrating in many South America countries. Lima, Peru. I watched the videos yesterday. They were one news agency was showing the worldwide celebrations about Maduro being out and the possible freedom for Venezuela. So it's not a total libtard decision at the United Nations. And now today, I haven't seen it yet. They may have already done it, but the Americans, the nations of the Americas, was going to have a meeting about it. But I think with the intelligence that we have, and thank goodness Elon and Trump are friends again, if they were ever enemies, but we have the intelligence capabilities to keep an eye on a lot of people. Starlink has completely encapsulated the planet. It's unbelievable. And they just lowered some of the Starlink satellites, a whole group, thousands of them, I think, because it was getting too crowded at the orbit they were in. I read that yesterday, too. Some of you may have seen it. Anyway, let me scroll this down. Now, this was put out this morning at 6:55 a.m. right there, and it's Cuba's one that steals Venezuelan oil and violates international law and human rights. Now, why are they're saying that, but this is the list and the pictures doesn't name all of them, but of the Cuban troops that were guarding Maduro and special forces, Delta, I think they said in the statements, ended their career. But so what we're seeing is an infiltration that, in other words, Venezuela is a playground for not only Iran, Russia, and China, but many of the South American countries, Cuba, Mexico. There was one, I think maybe was Brazil. They were happy. The leaders were. I think the people in all of the nations would be happy if you get rid of the dictators. But there was a couple of South American nations that were very happy this has happened. They're trying to run a legitimate nation. But again, guys, we got problems right on our back door, and it's a shame because the Cuban people would make great southern neighbors. And if it was all opened up with no sanctions and none of that, they would be very wealthy, simply because you wouldn't want to overdo it, but the tourist industry alone, just like Florida, I wouldn't want to see it destroyed like you see the beaches in Florida with all the high rises. It's sickening. But I'm sure that you'd probably get a few, but at least you'd have the hand off the necks of the people. Trade would become easier. Cost of goods would go down. The people would be very happy. Anybody would be under a dictatorship. So we've got a major problem worldwide and it's been accessing our back door. Thank you, Mayorkas and Obama. Thank you. Now, we're looking at the Zero Hedge website, guys, and what they're saying is Cuba security state colonization in Americas. Proven by Delta Force killing 32 intel agents surrounding Maduro. Again, this morning. This came out at 10:45. For years, the Cuban regime has insisted that its presence in Venezuela was benign, limited to doctors, nurses, and sports trainers offering humanitarian solidarity. The deaths of 32 Cuban military and intelligence personnel while defending Maduro have now shattered that fiction. Again, they were talking about it on the plane between Trump and Lindsey Graham, about Cuba was in trouble and had a lot to do with all of this. As early as March 2019, Cuba's ambassador to Canada, Josefina Vidal, appeared on CBC News to denounce Canadian reporting on Cuba's security intervention in Venezuela. They were complaining. She dismissed the claims outright, and she was being told to do that. But for a long time, Or really, you think about it, how long has Russia had a very strong grip on Cuba? And it may all tie together in this movement from Cuba south to Venezuela across the Caribbean. It says she dismissed the claims outright. The assertion that thousands of Cubans would allegedly be inserted into the structures of the armed and security forces of Venezuela supporting the government of legitimate President Nicolas Maduro is a scandalous slander. She's obviously Democrat, right? That's what they do. Today, that proof is unmistakable. These men did not die treating patients or coaching athletes. They were killed as part of Maduro's inner security ring, exposing Cuba's central role in exporting its intelligence and repression model to keep authoritarian allies in power. So Cuba, not the Cuban people, the Cuban military political arm, you're in big trouble. You've been killing thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans with your drug deals. Mexico, you have too. The leaders, the people, just like in Iran, they're trying to turn against this. And we don't know what intelligence the U.S. had. They've been knowing this was Cuba run. Again, they've mentioned back to 2007 on information and suspicion going on that this had happened. So it looks like Venezuela let Cuba and possibly Russia, China, Iran destroy their elections and try to run the U.S. elections from Venezuela. Same voting machines, from my understanding. And now that's being exposed, so there's going to be rats running in different directions, but a couple of them are very powerful rats. So we've got to pay attention. It's, again, we talked about it this morning in the chat. Keeping an eye on the demons and what they're doing is part of surviving in this material realm, the physical realm. So as long as I'm here, I'm going to keep an eye out on what these people are doing on both sides. But this looks like there's going to be a major conflict, guys. This is not just Venezuela alone anymore. You're going to be dealing with Cuba, 90 miles off the Florida coast, and you're going to be dealing with Mexico. There's Colombia is not happy because the people are happy, but the leaders are really mad because first thing Maduro did was throw them under the bus and said the drugs were coming from them. They're denying, and they are saying they're against Maduro being taken and all that, but if Maduro were to go back now, Colombia would take him out so quickly. He would wish he had stayed in the U.S. But again, this has exposed Cuba's central role in exporting its intelligence and the repression model to keep authoritarian allies in power and in line. It says this reality did not emerge overnight. Cuban-Venezuelan Security Cooperation dates back at least 2008. I'm sorry I said 2007. Anyway, when both regimes signed agreements granting Havana extraordinary influence over Venezuela's armed forces and intelligence services. Under these accords, Cuba trained Venezuelan soldiers, restructured key military units, trained intelligence agents in Havana, and most consequentially, reorientated Venezuela's intelligence apparatus away from external threats and towards surveilling its own officers and commanders. Like I said, they took over Venezuela, guys. So we freed the Venezuelan people from Cuba. This transformation proved vital to regime survival, allowing it to neutralize internal dissent and consolidate power for more than 2 decades. And the Democrats are screaming foul. You know, he had a $25 million bounty on his head, Maduro did, but it was put on by Biden. Not Trump, by Biden. But Biden did it because they knew they weren't going to do anything. So they can't blame Trump. That's how stupid they are. That architecture of control became fully visible January 3rd, 2026. That's when we took him. During Operation Absolute Resolve, a U.S. military operation carried out by Delta Force and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment that resulted in the capture of Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, and their transfer to the U.S. We didn't watch it, we heard about it. January 5th, Maduro appeared in federal court, New York, yesterday to face a four-count indictment accusing him of leading a 25-year narco-terrorism conspiracy. Now, they pulled a mummy out of a coffin. I think he's 92 years old. He was, Clinton appointed him, Slick Willie, to do the case against Maduro in New York. Now, imagine that. You're risking the U.S. forces' lives to get Maduro. Probably cost us millions. And you're going to turn him over to a New York libtarded judge? That's an insult. Just saying, that's an insult. During the operation, 32 Cuban operatives from the Revolutionary Armed Forces and the Ministry of the Interior were killed while defending Maduro. Their deaths were not denied by Havana. We just saw that. The embassy here in the U.S. was having a mourning festival. Their deaths were not denied by Havana. On the contrary, the Cuban government confirmed both the casualties and their military ranks in a presidential decree number 1147, signed by Miguel Diaz-Canel, which also declared 2 days of national mourning. The decree amounted to an extraordinary omission. Cuban state forces were embedded at the highest levels of Venezuela's security apparatus. You don't think the descendants of Castro that are still trying to hold power are not trembling in their boots? They're probably already in Colombia. Cuba would be a very good 52nd state after Venezuela. But, you know, we heard Trump say that we were going to remain there until order was put in place, basically, and they had control back over the ExxonMobil oil rigs that had been stolen, he said, and that we would keep the oil until we were paid back for all of that damage. Anyway, there was I mentioned some problems last night there with some of the Venezuelan security forces, and there were some shooting going on, and they were blaming it on drones, and then somebody said that they didn't know it was their own drones. I'm not sure. We're not going to get a lot of information out of there right now, but we are in a situation where Trump we had our backs to the wall, guys. They had infiltrated the nation. Thank you, Mayorkas again, and Biden. They had taken over South America, looks like, many places, as far as political and militarily. And they, with Canada's help, they were going to put the squeeze play on us. If we had not had people, including Doge, in place to stop the election fraud in this last election, guys, we would be over with. Enough people prayed that our Father did not let it happen. We have a chance, and Trump realizes that. But they are there like wolves at the door, both north and south, in both oceans. So you're going to see a lot going on, I think. I don't think Trump's going to back away. He may go slow, we don't know, but what will happen? What will be the response of the other nations? The smaller ones like Cuba itself, we probably won't hear a lot out of that. I think they need to change the embassy out, the personnel there in New York or in D.C. also, because they're definitely libtard spies. The only reason they probably haven't is because we hear every word they say. Although the Cuban regime did not officially disclose their names, the independent Cuban outlet 14Y Media identified 6 of the deceased, along with their ranks and provinces of origin, using social media posts, private messages, and partial confirmations from local authorities. Most were from eastern Cuba, particularly Granma and Santiago de Cuba. Among them were Fernando Baez Hidalgo, 26, linked to the Interior Ministry's Personal Security Directorate. Landy Osorio Lopez, a state security operative deployed in Caracas. That's where they got Maduro. And Yordenis Malonis, reportedly part of the Venezuelan president's direct protection detail. Others appeared to belong to the Avaspis Negris Black Wasp, an Interior Ministry unit sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury for violently suppressing the July 11, 2021 pro-democracy protest. That's why the people are happy, not the Democrats. At least one of those kills was identified as a cryptographer. The extent of this penetration was underscored days later by Marco Rubio, who stated that Maduro's entire security structure was effectively controlled by Cubans. Those who guarded him, those who monitored loyalty within the regime, and those who kept him insulated from his own people, kept him separated. He was their puppet and monitored loyalty within the regime. In other words, beat down the dissidents. This model of exported repression is not unique to Venezuela. A similar pattern has taken root in Nicaragua. Since the mass protest in April 2018, credible reports or accounts from retired Nicaraguan military officers, including Major Roberto Samcam, indicated that dictator Daniel Ortega had increasingly surrounded himself, with Cuban advisors embedded in his security apparatus, displacing Nicaraguan personnel who once formed the inner circle. They took over Venezuela. It's obvious, and that's what they're talking about. And on the plane ride yesterday, it's very interesting. I may can get a clip of that. Then they talked about Cuba big time. And when Lindsey Graham and there's agreeing with Trump and on attacking somebody, you better watch out, because he loves it. Now, I still don't know exactly how Cuba did it. We're talking about Venezuela, we're talking about Nicaragua now. Such a small nation, they had help, is my concern. Big time, big heavy help. Independent reporting suggests that roughly 60 Cuban advisors operate within Nicaragua's military and security structure. The drug trade, the cartels, overseeing surveillance, loyalty screening, again, suppression and repression. During Operation Cleanup in April 2018, Cuban special forces reportedly operated alongside of paramilitary units during mass arrest and the violent dismantling of civilian resistance. This is an archetypal case of the Cubanization of repression. That's what Castro did. The military operation that led to Maduro's capture signals a decisive shift in U.S. credibility and deterrence. For years, autocrats faced little cost as U.S. responses were limited to statements and sanctions that failed to change behavior. Why? Because there's too many Democrats and possibly some rhinos that have been taking cartel money to keep their mouths shut for years. Pelosi and Maduro were very expensive friends in the millions of dollars. And see, they've kept people in power. Cuba has, and whoever's running it, but it says 70% of the Venezuelans voted for Edmundo Gonzalez last year in the July 28, 2024 elections. And he ran on stopping the corruption and all of that crap, getting their energy infrastructure built back up for oil and exports and make his country rich. They couldn't have that. They said sustained oil production growth is unrealistic under a corrupt criminal regime. By contrast, J.B. Morgan estimates that a political transition could raise output to 1.3 to 1.4 million barrels per day within 2 years and potentially 2.5 million over the next decade. That's a lot of oil. And you would create jobs there. Much of the money would stay there. And eventually they would take it back over if it could be controlled. But what has got to happen? We talked about cutting the heads off of the snakes here in the U.S. Looks like they're pretty worldwide, especially with this group, and it's widespread through the South. And again, that's probably why the lovely Canadian Prime Minister got the hell out of Dodge when he did. He knew what was coming, just like Tim Walz knows, and a few others. Says the eventual fall of the regime would have far-reaching regional consequences, deepening Cuba's isolation, fracturing the authoritarian axis with Russia, curbing the influence of China and Iran, weakening ELN and FARC groups in Colombia limited to drug trafficking, and helping stem the largest mass exodus in Latin American history. Again, thank you, Biden and Mayorkas. Despite the deaths of the 32 Cuban operatives, as long as the Venezuelan regime remains in power, it's not Venezuelan, it's Cuban regime. Get it right. As long as the Cuban regime intelligence advisors stay in power, they will continue to be embedded across multiple spheres of influence. These deaths reveal how authoritarian regimes sustain one another through intelligence sharing and the export of repression, regardless of the human cost. That's exactly right. And you don't think Biden and them were in full process of doing that with us? And the Democrats were heavily involved in this, and they need to be taken out also. Again, Trump mentioned on the plane ride, something I almost forgot, with some of these states that the Supreme Court just told Trump that he could not have the National Guard there. Portland was mentioned, that's a city, of course. L.A. was mentioned. I think Minneapolis and Chicago maybe were mentioned as far as the Insurrection Act guys. That was Trump talking about it, reporters asking him about it on the plane, I think yesterday evening or last night. And so they know what is going on, and Trump is not going to give out too many details in advance. He may let you know you might be in trouble, but until it all happens, nobody's going to know what's coming. And so the world now knows that there's a different sheriff in the Americas, all of the Americas. What will they do? That the reaction will be something we have to pay attention to. It says repressive regimes do not stand alone. They sustain one another. That's the problem. The Cubans who died defending Maduro did so not in defense of Venezuela, but in defense of a repressive system responsible for crimes against humanity, torture, political imprisonment, enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. Look at Mexico. A system built on surveillance, fear, and impunity. Their deaths mark not only the collapse of a security ring, but the unmasking, this is the big deal, the unmasking of an entire axis of repression in the Americas. For you guys that don't like Trump, you better thank your father that he got elected, because Mayorkas was right in the middle of this. There was reports of him being all the way down that trail, coming from the Texas border all the way into South America, into Venezuela, all those areas, and Black Hawk helicopters full of cash to build the camps and to give to people. Our taxpayer money, millions of dollars. There were videos of that. Building big camps, bringing buses in, big cafeterias, everything you would need to mass migrate and make it easy. And then hand them free cards for everything they need and with our taxpayer money. That's why, again, regardless of what happened, and as dirty as many of these rhino Republicans are, keep an eye on the midterms. Make sure you get out and vote, even if it puts a bad taste in your mouth, because there could be a much worse taste if the last 4 years before this had continued. We may not even be free. Half of us would probably be dead that do reports like this. We've definitely been suppressed and in trouble. Just like the J6ers. That's how close it was. So get out, make sure that it does not happen. I don't think there's that many stupid people, but the big blue cities are the danger. So get in there, you talk to your friends and family. This is the year to make sure that the Democrats do not get in control, even though we have to put up with some dumb rhinos like Mr. Thune, who needs to go. We're going to be keeping an eye on them and their votes on this Obama health care extension. Trump's trying to stop it, keep the money that the people have it, not to the insurance companies. Now Thune is caving in to extending that grift for 3 years suddenly. But he got busted with that and the fact that he has committed election fraud, the campaign fraud side of it, with over $1.1 million of false. It was what they call their Smurf situation. We saw it with a lot of Democrats, and I explained it once, but you get a lot of elderly people, you get their names, and you make it look like they're donating $25 a day to keep it under the max, or keep it at the minimum, and they do it for the entire voting period of time. And the elderly people whose names are being used don't even know what's happening. But they have, if you look at the records that are now coming out, their name would be there for hundreds of times. And Thune is on there for 1.1 million. He's got to go. And he's got to come back to D.C. tomorrow. They were supposed to do some stuff today, and they may at 5:30, we'll see, on this health care situation. But you know he's going to have to hang that head down just a little bit lower. And I hope Trump goes after him, at least the DOJ. We're watching this, guys. Other things will be happening. Still working on the series coming out of Egypt, that information. And I think it's important. It doesn't get a lot of hits, but there's 3,000 or 4,000, 5,000 of you guys that really enjoy it, and that really is as large as any church anywhere. And you guys are searching, and like I said, they don't get a lot of hits, those videos, but it doesn't matter. The people that matter are listening. And I appreciate it because of what it means to you. As I'm trying to understand it, I try to explain it, and it works out. And it will continue working out. And the deeper you get into the explanation and telling other people about, you'll start to realize some of the things I mentioned yesterday about the attacks and the intelligent interference on your transmission between you and your father. It is a real thing. And the more you become aware of it, like I am, then, and I'm just, it's a new journey for many of us. But the awareness of it, you will start to see the attacks increase. And that's a way of building up your defense even stronger. But we're dealing with a very dark level, very intelligent level of demons that did not want this earth. They did not want the humans to survive. And this earth and this dimension has a lot to do with them and their suppression. And so the Democrats and people like these regime leaders get it from their father. Anyway, we're watching it. Watch for updates on that. We'll see you soon. Be safe.